Welcome back to another Before You Read lecture. This is a lecture on the book of Jeremiah, the prophetic book of Jeremiah, which is a significantly long writing. And so we won't be able to cover all of Jeremiah in this video lecture, but the hope is that we will get a brief orientation to the book of Jeremiah and a few notes about how to get a sense of the persona and the message of Jeremiah the prophet. I want to begin with a orientation to the book of Jeremiah. In terms of its complexity, it rivals the book of Isaiah in terms of how difficult it is to make sense of it, and in terms of the various traditions and textual issues that it displays. There are some obvious differences between the Hebrew version, which is known as the Masoretic text, and the Greek version, preserved in what we call the Septuagint. The Greek, in fact, omits entire passages and rearranges major sections. And there is some scholarship that suggests that the Greek version may actually have some earlier materials. It may represent the earlier text than the Masoretic text. John Collins, in his introduction to the Old Testament, suggests that there are 4 basic types of materials in the book of Jeremiah that don't necessarily they aren't distinguished by their placement or their linear placement in the book of Jeremiah. But these include poetic oracles, as we've seen in many of the other prophetic writings, third-person narratives about the prophet Jeremiah. So in places, Jeremiah speaks in more or less the first person, and then other places, Jeremiah is described by a narrator that many assume is a companion of Jeremiah's named Baruch. There are sermonic prose passages resembling what we see in Deuteronomy when Moses addresses the people of Israel. And there is a section of oracles against the nations, as we've seen, for example, in the prophet Amos. Kathleen O'Connor, a scholar who some of you know well, who taught for many years Old Testament at Columbia Seminary, in the New Interpreter's Study Bible, suggests that there are 2 basic parts to the book of Jeremiah. The first 25 chapters, so 1 through 25, essentially are explaining why the nation of Israel and of Judah fell to Babylon, the reasons why. And there is in this first section a bit of a, sort of an arc where the opening chapters are really a warning, a call to repentance, hey, people are coming from the north and it's not going to end well for us, to the end where the destruction of Jerusalem is actually really close or has occurred. And then in chapters 26 through 52, this is the second half of Jeremiah. This really is about how the nation can survive. How is the nation going to respond to exile and to the destruction of Jerusalem? That second part of the book of Jeremiah is really where we see the majority of the third-person description about Jeremiah. Kathleen O'Connor says of the book of Jeremiah that its principal subject is survival. So we might rightly regard the book of Jeremiah as survival literature. It is literature intended to help people survive. It is also right to describe it as trauma literature. It is literature addressing a significant social, national, and even individual trauma that was brought about by the Babylonian exile. Now, I've already said the Babylonian exile as if it's a single moment or a single thing, but scholars are actually aware that there were 3 different invasions and deportations of people from Jerusalem. The first in 597, then another in 587, and finally one in 582. The events around 587 were particularly traumatic, however. In this invasion, Babylon broke the city walls of Jerusalem. Many living there were killed. The royal palace is leveled, and the Jerusalem temple is destroyed. It was traumatic. It was It was just so disoriented. As O'Connor says, it shattered the ordinary domestic, social, and economic life of the people living in Jerusalem and Judah. In her introduction, again, O'Connor, I think, offers us a really wise word. She says, the book of Jeremiah may best be appreciated as a conversation among many communal voices that explore, attempt to come to grips with, and move beyond the national tragedy that destroyed so much of the community's life. Jeremiah is survival literature. It is trauma literature. It is coming to grips with tragedy. And it's a conversation. It is an attempt to make sense out of and explain this tragedy. It is right to think of Jeremiah as, in large part, a response to this trauma of exile. And there's a few things that I would point out, sort of broadly or generally, about this response. The first is to pay attention to the body of the prophet and the life of the prophet Jeremiah, because both Jeremiah's body and his life story become a sign of the nation's own destruction and restoration. The prophet Jeremiah performs the message through his body, through his own story. The second thing that you'll see in the book of Jeremiah is that there are competing perspectives about this exile. There's competing stories about how long it will last, about God's role in it, about what will happen, which I think reflects that during times of trauma, during times of social and national disaster, there's not a single message, a single interpretation. There are always competing voices, and we see this in the prophet Jeremiah. Another way that the prophet Jeremiah talks about exile is in these images of tearing down and building up. There is this tension between destruction and new creation, between annihilation and new creation. And so this is one of the ways that the trauma is responded to, that it is worked out, is saying, yes, something that we know has been destroyed, but there is something new that is coming as well. Another way in which Jeremiah responds to exile is by really reflecting and even echoing the message of Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomistic theology that we've seen elsewhere in the Old Testament, which is essentially that this really hard situation has come about because of Israel's religious infidelity, because they have gone after other gods, because they have succumbed to idolatry. This is the natural result. And finally, one of the distinctive things about Jeremiah in the response to exile is the idea, the exhortation really, that Israel settle in, that Judah get used to exile, that they plant gardens, that they give their sons and daughters away in marriage, that they pray for the well-being and the sake of the city, which suggests that it's not just going to be a moment and then it'll be over, but that they're going to need to live into the reality of exile. For the purposes of this lecture, I want to suggest some reading strategies. And the first is to clarify those portions of Jeremiah that I invite you to read. It's 52 chapters in length. It's really would require a significant amount of time to read it from cover to cover. And so again, I'm offering some selections that give you a sense of the persona of Jeremiah and some of his message. And so I invite you to read first Jeremiah's chapter 1 through 6. This is the beginning of Jeremiah. It includes his initial calling. It includes calls of repentance to both north, to Israel, and to south, Judah, and a clear warning about the destruction and exile that is coming. Then skip ahead to Jeremiah chapters 10 through 13. Again, we'll hear words of judgment against the sins and the consequences of those sins. But we will also get more of Jeremiah's persona, his personality, and especially the way in which his body takes on the prophetic message. And finally, read Jeremiah 27 through 33. This is sort of after exile. The reality of exile has set in, the trauma has occurred, and we again learn more about Jeremiah's personality. It's largely spoken in the third person, so you'll get a feel for what that's like. And it also bears witness to these competing claims, even among the prophets of the time. And finally, in chapters 30 through 33, you'll read this quote-unquote little book of consolation, which gives us a clear message of the hope that is sort of behind the desolation of Jeremiah. So again, Jeremiah 1 through 6, 10 through 13, and 27 through 33. And as you read, I invite you to consider three questions. The first is, what metaphors or types of relationships are used to describe God's relationship with God's people? The second is, what have Israel and Judah done wrong, and how does God want them to change or to respond? And then finally, where do you see hope in Jeremiah's prophecy? It is a traumatic, hard message, but where do you see hope? Jeremiah is a prophet of judgment, but also a prophet of hope, a prophet of disaster, but also of new creation. I think there's going to be plenty for you to observe and pay attention to, and I can't wait to hear from you. Happy reading.